Well, during my career, um, I've worked with various farmers around west central Minnesota, those particularly who still have some intact prairie on their land. In most cases, I have found that they really honor the fact that they are stewards of this really important resource. And I've also found that they um, have developed some pretty innovative and smart ways of managing their land. And that involves typically raising grass-fed cattle on their land, but doing it in a way that honors the seasonality of the prairie. So they know, for example, that right away in the spring, you can't turn your cattle out onto the prairie. You have to wait until the grasses are actively growing midsummer, and that's when you take your cattle out there. Now you might think, well, how can grazing possibly be good for a prairie? I mean, don't we want to let the plants grow and flower? And if you manage it right, there are parts that are flowering and then parts that are mowed down by the cattle. But what the cattle are doing is replacing one of the critical aspects of the original prairie ecosystem that no longer exists in the abundance it what once did, and that's the herds of bison that we had. So we had millions of bison on the landscape out here, and they would essentially, what we understand about their biology is that they would move en masse into an area and they would graze it hard, and they would wallow and take dust baths and stomp things and eat, and then they would move on en masse. And they may not come back to this patch of prairie because there were, millions of acres for several years. But their disturbance was hugely important to allow different microenvironments for different species to establish, seeds to get they break up the soil and seeds will become established. They put urine and feces on the prairie that provides, or is recycling nitrogen that makes a little patch of fertilizer for plants. And so cattle don't behave exactly the same way bison do. Cattle tend to eat all the plants equally, where bison tended to um, target the grasses, which are the most aggressive plants. But used wisely, cattle are our next best approximation of bison. I think beef cattle are vilified as agents of climate change. And they are when they're grown in an industrial situation, because they're producing lots of methane. That's a hugely important greenhouse gas. But I don't think enough attention has been paid to this grass-fed cattle situation, which has it's a low input agriculture, because the solar energy is what's driving the production of these beef cattle. And yeah, they're still producing some methane, but I still haven't seen a good analysis, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough to see really in an excellent grass-fed situation if we aren't sequestering more carbon than we're releasing. So I think that's an area of agriculture that deserves a lot more emphasis, I guess, in research. Um, but I've been proud to work with these farmers who are really conscious stewards of what we have left of the prairie. And and I also found out that as a scientist, I think scientists are like, well, we know all this stuff and we're going to tell you about how to manage this. And really, people who've been good stewards of the land for a long time know way more than I ever did. And they could tell me, I would give them data and they'd be like, oh yeah, that just confirms what I already knew. It's nice to have the numbers, but yeah, I had observed that long before you told me anything about it. So that was humbling. It's been a pleasure to talk to you too, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me today.